Society, Culture, and Reform, 1820 to 1860. Looking at the Unit 4 on our road to disunion. So first we need to talk about some population shifts that are happening during this time period in the United States. It's a period of big growth, and you can see people are moving west. We've talked about that before. And you can see where the population density is in this map, with most people concentrated still along the eastern seaboard, and here in the Ohio River Valley region. But you can see they're pushing further and further west into this new territory. So these population shifts are demonstrated in this graph, where you can see that by 1860 we already have 31 million people in the United States. So the population is just exploding at this time. And part of that is because of immigration. You have a lot of people coming to the United States, especially in those years of 1820 to 1840. Immigration just begins to take off. So where are these people settling? What are they doing? Well, they're attracted here for a lot of reasons. One is the economy, and the vast amount of land. Europe didn't have a lot of land resources anymore. It was pretty much maxed out. And so people were coming here for cheap land and to find new jobs. One of the big things is an event that happened actually in Ireland around the early 1800s, which is the Irish potato famine. Potatoes being a staple of their diet. And here on this map you can see that in 1847 how many people were taking government rations because of the Irish potato famine. So people were literally starving to death, so they had to leave. And many of them either died or families just picked up and moved to other places. And most of where they moved, most of those people emigrated out of Ireland and into the United States. So here you see boatloads of Irish folks trying to find a new life in the United States. So the United States starts to get its reputation as a land for immigrants at this time. You can see the biggest portion of immigrants from 1820 to 1840 are actually the Irish, and that is because of that potato famine. But you also had Germans coming in at this time. And that leads to some negative consequences for those populations. Just like we see with any immigrant population even today, they tend to be scapegoated and blamed for a lot of things that happen in society. But you can see there was also lots of land being advertised for immigrants, encouraging them to come to places like, Central Texas. And this is part of this idea of manifest destiny, this idea that we'll get into in the next unit more, but I need to mention it briefly now, is that it was this belief that it was our destiny as Americans to basically spread out from sea to shining sea from both continents, and it was justified and it was inevitable. And you'll see this drives a lot of our public policy in the 1800s all the way into the 1900s. And these immigrants actually saw this as an opportunity, like I said, to get land that they would not have been able to purchase in Europe at this time. You also have industrialization starting at this time, and you have innovations in communication and transportation. Samuel Morse invents the telegraph, wire services, newspapers, so you have mass production of newspapers happening at this time. So they're pretty big, important events. News could be quickly transmitted over Samuel Morse's telegraph, and syndicated and printed, the same story printed in multiple newspapers in multiple cities. So here's the Morse code. So play with the Morse code sometime. It's kind of fun. You also see with industrialization the rise of manufacturing, particularly in the Northeast. As you may recall from world history, this industrialization begins in the textile industry, and it fuels the mass production of cotton in the South. And in fact, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, which is a tool that allowed them to separate the fluffy part from the like pointy sharp shell of the cotton plant. They used to have to do that by hand and it would take a long time. And now with the cotton gin, they could process a lot more cotton more quickly. You also have the development of modern corporations, which allow for a system of what we call limited liability. So a corporation files with the state government for this charter that says they have a board of directors and that there is no one person that is necessarily responsible for their actions, but that the whole corporation is. And we also have laws that are passed at this time that say corporations are individuals. So corporations gain a lot of strength. You also have the Lowell system, which was where in the North, labor relies primarily on unmarried women, particularly immigrant women were attracted to these factories in the North. So you had these women that were called Lowell girls, and the Lowell girls actually lived in dorms and worked at these factories. And here are some of them right there, and they're actually holding some of the modern technology that improved weaving, and it is a shuttle that you threw through the loom and it went really quickly. So some of the effects of industrialization is we had an increased reliance on slavery in the South because of the cotton gin. So you could produce more cotton, so you needed more people to pick cotton and plant cotton. You have the de-skilling of workers in the Northeast due to mass production. You only had one piece of the production that you were doing. You didn't need to be able to make a product from beginning to end. So because of this reliance on manufactured goods, we saw people losing job skills. So here you can see all of these women standing in front of factory machines, and they just work on their one little piece. You had an increased reliance on manufacturing, particularly in the Northeast. That has all kinds of consequences, including environmental consequences, which we'll talk about later. And you had the rise and development of trade unions, people organizing to get things like fair wages and how many hours a day they should work, etc. And there's a Supreme Court case that actually legalizes the existence of trade unions. It's called the Commonwealth versus Hunt. Then you also have an increase in wealth inequality. You have people who are getting very wealthy off these manufacturing plants, and then you still have a working class poor, and you have the rise of a middle class, and you have pretty much the development of haves and have-nots in society. So here you have some wealthy folks ice skating in Central Park. This is the Canal Age, and this is part of the internal infrastructure improvements that were a result of the American system developed by Henry Clay. Songs like Low Bridge, everybody down Low Bridge, 'cause we're coming into town. Yes, I sing on occasion. It's the Erie Canal. You also have these religious revivals, and we've mentioned this before, but I just want to bring it up again because it kind of ties in with the society and culture of this time. You have sort of reactions to the Enlightenment. You have populist movements that are offering salvation for everybody. And you had that Second Great Awakening in New York with those revivalism and tent meetings. You have Charles Finney in the burned over district where it was like fire and brimstone. You have Baptists and Methodists in the South and the West. And then you have Mormonism, which we didn't really talk about before. And Joseph Smith has his revelation in the woods, and then he moves into Ohio, he moves into Missouri, then he moves to Illinois, and he keeps getting persecuted and forced out of all of those places, and ultimately he ends up migrating. Well, he dies, but then the Mormons migrate to Utah, which is called New Zion, under the leadership of Brigham Young after Joseph Smith is killed by a mob. He wasn't a very popular guy, and was also at a time when people were really testy about all kinds of stuff, including slavery. So people just got fired up really fast. Okay, so the significance. In the North, it inspired social reform movements, and in the South, it encouraged westward expansion. Here's Brigham Young, who took his Mormon families west on the Immigrant Trail. You also have new cultural ideas and literature very unique to America that spring up. First, a group of authors who are called the Transcendentalists. They include Ralph Waldo Emerson. He spoke a lot about and wrote about self-reliance and independence of thinking. You had Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the book Walden, which is still seen as sort of the ultimate transcendental book. I think you might even read it in 12th grade, maybe. And he lived by himself in the woods for 2 years in a cabin on Walden Pond, and he wrote about it, and he's kind of one of our early ecologists and biologists, and he also encouraged civil disobedience, like not paying your taxes, and as a way to disobey unjust laws. And these transcendentalists were looking for nature, for God, and they challenged American mainstream materialism and the pursuit of wealth. And sometimes they tried to create sort of communes. It's almost a very hippie ideal in the 1800s. So there's a picture of Walden Pond. You also had other communal experiences that died out. People were viewed as being too materialistic. So you had the Transcendentalists on the Brook Farm. You had the Shakers, which are kind of similar to the Quakers, except I think I mentioned them before. They did not actually allow men and women to cohabitate after they joined the commune. So even married couples had to live and be separately and in a celibate life. So unless they converted people, they were not essentially breeding, and therefore they died out. They were in Texas and in Maine. Then you had New Harmony, which was a group of secular socialists who tried to create a utopian society, and the Oneida community. They all tried these communal experiences, but none of them really worked. So you also had a style of painting that develops at this time. It's called the Hudson River School style of painting. It was very romantic, fascination with the natural world, lots of Jesus rays in the paintings, those sorts of things. With architecture, you had Greek revivalism, particularly in the antebellum South, where you had a lot of columns and democratic ideals portrayed in the buildings. But you also saw this in a lot of public buildings as well. Our Capitol, our White House, these big buildings that are sort of notorious for our nation come out of this style of architecture. And with literature, you had sort of this sense of nationalism and American pride, and books were written in very unique American settings. You had James Fenimore Cooper that wrote The Last of the Mohicans, Washington Irving, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. And they're all sort of questioning conformity. There's The Last of the Mohicans for you. And out of this, you also have people that are interested in reforming society. You have temperance. There was a high rate of alcohol consumption in the United States, and people in the temperance organizations thought that it was the cause of all of society's problems. So you had groups that formed, like the American Temperance Society, which was pushed by ministers, Protestant ministers, and they pushed for dry towns and counties and taxation of liquor. You had women's temperance crusades, women's temperance organizations, the Anti-Saloon League, which actually was responsible for blowing up the one and only bar that ever existed in my hometown until about 5 years ago. No, crazy. And you had people who were making moral arguments not to drink. Alcoholism should be treated as a disease and needed treatment. And this was met resistance with German and Irish immigrants who alcohol plays a big role in their cultures. But they didn't have political power. They weren't really voters. They weren't citizens. And it involved a lot of racism. Hun is a derogatory term that is associated with Germans. It kind of loses its steam because of the slavery issue, but it's always kind of in the background from the early 1800s into the early 1900s. And we will stop there. For part B, stay tuned.